Today, we're going to look at dietary guidelines. Who came up with these guidelines? And do they really help, or do they hurt people? Before we get into our subject, let me remind you to consider subscribing to this channel and then click that bell icon so you'll be notified every time we post a new video. And always remember that in the description there will be a link that will take you to a catalog of all the videos available to you on Beat Diabetes. On last Friday's program, we looked at the documentary titled Fat Fiction, which dealt with the way fat has been vilified by nearly every expert for a long, long time. And we questioned whether that vilification was justified. Today, we'll continue to look at the Fat Fiction documentary with a focus on the dietary guidelines. Probably most people do not feel competent to come up with their own rules for eating and good nutrition. So they do what seems reasonable. They look to other people they consider more educated and more knowledgeable than they are in the area of what comprises a healthy diet. And often that means looking at something called guidelines. One definition of guidelines is this: a statement or other indication of policy or procedure by which to determine a course of action. So a guideline is essentially what to do about something, what principles to follow or employ if you want success in a certain area. Now, anybody can create a set of guidelines. I can, you can, anybody can. But in most cases, we want to hear from the experts, the people who really know what they're talking about. And when it comes to optimum health, we assume that the guidelines should come from organizations that are comprised of health experts, the doctors, the nutritionists, the people who've thought long and hard on the subject of health, diet, and nutrition. We assume they can tell us which diet is best, what we should eat, what we should avoid eating to live long and be healthy. And for people who are diabetic or pre-diabetic, well, we have a special interest in the subject of diet as it relates to us driving diabetes out of our life, if possible, or at a minimum trying to hold off diabetes with its terrible complications as long as we possibly can. In America, three major sources for dietary guidelines that are often referred to and looked towards are the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, and the Food and Drug Administration. Surely, we reason to ourselves they can tell us what to eat and how to eat so that we can improve our chances of staying free from diabetic complications. And when we study these guidelines, we find that they all converge on a couple of simple truths. They encourage us to eat a diet very low in fat, and to eat whole grain products rather than white bread products, and eat lots of fruits and vegetables. Traditionally, they've been a bit ambiguous about sugar. They don't exactly recommend it, but they seem a little bit reticent to condemn sugar outright. Seems like their attitude has been, well, you don't have to give up sugar entirely, but just don't overdo it. Dr. Sarah Hallberg, who's become one of the generals in the low-carb army, burst onto the scene through a TED Talk video she did, which has now been seen by millions of people on YouTube. This video transformed her from local obesity doctor into a low-carb superstar in a very short time. And it's fascinating to read the title of this video that was so popular. The title she chose for her talk is Reversing Type 2 Diabetes Starts with Ignoring the Guidelines. To me, that says it all. Dr. Sarah declares with that provocative title that if you really want to see victory over diabetes and see your glucose levels and your A1C scores decreasing rather than increasing, you're going to have to ignore the guidelines, those rules and principles that most people trust, which spring from our U.S. government, the American Heart Association, and the American Diabetes Association. In her brief little 18-minute talk, she declares forcefully and plainly that she's seeing tremendous success in turning diabetics into former diabetics by doing nearly the exact opposite of what these organizations recommend. The testimony she shares and her logic are so irrefutable that you wonder who could ever hear this little talk and not be convinced that, as she says, reversing type 2 diabetes starts with ignoring the guidelines, the very guidelines that Americans have believed and clung to with a stubborn and unwavering loyalty for the last 40 years. In the Fat Fiction video, Sarah states this: fat is central to any science-based nutrition recommendation for anyone who struggles with type 2 diabetes. Carbohydrates cause our insulin and glucose to go up. Proteins, much less, and with fat, there's no glucose or insulin reaction. And given the fact that type 2 diabetes is a problem with elevated glucose, we can't be recommending the macronutrient that's going to cause glucose and insulin to go up. But that's exactly what MyPlate and the ADA guidelines do. They recommend us to eat the macronutrient that's causing the problem. Recommending that a diabetic eat lots of carbs is like telling an alcoholic to be sure and drink lots of whiskey, or telling a person riddled with fears to always watch 3 terrifying horror movies every day, or insisting that someone with peanut allergies should eat 3 bottles of peanuts daily. It's illogical, it's absurd, and most of all, it just doesn't work. In the Fat Fiction documentary, they feature a doctor who spent most of his adult years counseling diabetics and telling them to eat low-fat diets. He says, in all my years of practice, I never saw anyone cured of diabetes by going on a low-fat diet. Never, not one time. No one came off insulin. So this doctor hadn't taken any patients off insulin ever in his entire career, but once he became convinced of the power and effectiveness of a low-carb, high-fat diet, in 5 months of recommending keto/low-carb diets, he got 11 patients off insulin completely. Well, logic says if you're doing one thing and it never works, and then you switch to another strategy that works beautifully and consistently, maybe you ought to stay with the new strategy and forget about the old one. One of this doctor's patients said this: in 3 months, I went from insulin 5 times a day to no insulin and was able to maintain normal blood sugars. Nutritionist Johnny Bowden says, you know what doesn't raise insulin at all? Fat. 0, not a drop. It doesn't move the needle. So, telling people to eat a diet that's absent of the one macronutrient that has no effect on the fat storage hormone? It's total sheer madness. Endocrinologist Robert Lustig says, the dietary guidelines are guidelines for the food industry to be able to sell food. They have nothing to do with health. Wow, nothing to do with health. Now, I have to say I'm not quite as cynical as Dr. Lustig. I like to think that most of these people working for the health department of the government and the American Diabetes Association and the American Heart Association really do believe that the diet they're advocating is good for people. But whether their motives are pure or not pure, one thing is for sure, the guidelines they're dumping on the American public and much of the world is a diet that does nothing to drive away diabetes. And by convincing gullible people that by switching from white bread to whole wheat bread and making sure to eat lots of bananas and mangoes and taking their sugar in moderation, in thinking that this will help them fix their diabetes, these so-called experts are doing more harm than good. Of course, these same experts will tell you that you really can't fix your diabetes. After all, we all know diabetes is a chronic and progressive condition. But they dare to hope that if you follow their advice, you'll at least delay the inevitable. Nutritionist Johnny Bowden says, the USDA, when it was founded, had 2 mandates. Mandate number 1 was to provide information to the American public about healthy eating. Mandate number 2 was to support, encourage, and grow the American agricultural industry. Those 2 mandates are not always congruent with one another. If you were really being honest with the American public, you'd say wheat, corn, sugar, and soy are not health foods. 4 of the 5 biggest crops that are made in America. Dr. Jason Fung describes the disaster that followed as these 3 groups, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the American Diabetes Association, and the American Heart Association, convinced us to slash that fat out of our diets, stating we went from eating natural foods and butter to trans fats, which we now know was super deadly for heart attacks. That is mind-blowing that we told people to stop eating butter and eat this poison instead, and it would be good for you, and we all did it. In the documentary, they show you a television commercial from around the 1970s that featured a pretty Native American lady with a box of Mazola margarine in her hands. She declares, "This is Mazola, made from 100% corn oil, made from 100% corn oil goodness." Corn oil goodness. Just makes you want to smear Mazola margarine over every possible food you can, just to get more and more of that corn oil goodness. In the documentary, they show a small experiment where they encouraged people to follow the government guidelines for a week. They show a lady describing her breakfast with these words. Today's breakfast was oatmeal with raisins and brown sugar. Following a USDA MyPlate 2,000 calorie a day meal plan downloaded from the USDA website, it calls for low-fat meats, including non-fat sugar-sweetened chocolate milk, and plenty of carbohydrates, things like lasagna, bread, and even pizza. One lady described the menu as stuff you would take to a college dorm. They showed another lady preparing breakfast with shredded wheat, a half a cup of sliced banana, with half a cup of fat-free milk and some toast. And there was 1 cup of fat-free chocolate milk, and also allowed were 2 teaspoons of jelly to be placed on her toast. Dr. Mark Hyman comments, "This breakfast alone contains 150 grams of carbohydrates and 50 grams of sugar." After eating this way for a week, one of the participants said, "I have to admit, I'm not liking it. I'm hungry all day." Now, to be fair, I have to say these organizations are beginning to alter their guidelines a bit and show some evidence of change. But they're changing slowly and very reluctantly. Mark Hyman says, in 2015, after more than 50 years of condemning food like eggs, lobster, and shrimp, the American Heart Association quietly dropped their long-standing recommendation against dietary cholesterol, saying it's no longer a nutrient of concern. That same year, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Committee removed the cap on dietary fat consumption, admitting there is no evidence that eating fat is bad for health. The American Heart Association, who takes much of its funding from big food and big pharma, continues to stand behind its long-held position that saturated fats are the cause of heart disease and that refined vegetable oils are heart healthy. And of course, they got this exactly backwards. Eventually, when the evidence becomes totally overwhelming, these organizations will quietly alter their guidelines. But I wouldn't look for any kind of apology. I doubt we'll find any of these organizations issuing a statement which reads something like, "Well, what we've been telling you for the last 50 years was wrong, totally wrong, dead wrong, fatally wrong, and we are truly sorry." No, more likely they'll just quietly make some alterations in their guidelines with as little fanfare as possible so as not to make themselves look too bad. But we don't know when this is going to happen. It may be 30 years from now, 50 years from now. We just don't know, and we don't have time to wait. And that's why we have to be open to alternative voices and alternative diets. And in my humble opinion, we have to rely on a short, little, tiny fella named Mike the blood sugar meter, to provide us with his set of dietary guidelines, which are vastly superior to the guidelines put out by all the nutritional elites of our world. Mike's guidelines, the ones that you'll get when you test your glucose spikes after various meals and foods, will be custom tailored to your own body. And Mike is not being paid by Big Pharma or by the sugar industry. In fact, Mike works for free. All he asks is a little drawer to live in when you're not putting him to use. Obesity researcher Dr. Zoe Harcombe says, The people at the top are not going to change, so we have to get this going as a bottom-up revolution and get more and more people on board until they're shamed into changing because the swell of the population is just ignoring them. Well said, Zoe. Let's shame those powers that be in the nutritional world by our cheerful testimonies of victories gained, A1Cs dramatically reduced, morning glucose levels brought down to normal, and diabetic complications reversed through a diet that is the exact opposite of what we've been brainwashed to believe was right. Or, to use the words of Sarah Hallberg, reversing type 2 diabetes starts with ignoring the guidelines. Now, one day, I'm convinced these organizations will catch up with us and those words will no longer apply. And then we'll be able to follow the guidelines because the guidelines will be changed and corrected. And that will be a glorious day.